Breaking the spell of negative emotions. Most of us let our negative emotions persist longer than is necessary. Becoming suddenly angry, we tend to stay angry, and this requires that we actively produce the feeling of anger. We do this by thinking about our reasons for being angry, recalling an insult, rehearsing what we should have said to our malefactor, and so forth. And yet we tend not to notice the mechanics of this process. Without continually resurrecting the feeling of anger, it is impossible to stay angry for more than a few moments. While I can't promise that meditation will keep you from ever again becoming angry, you can learn not to stay angry for very long. And when talking about the consequences of anger, the difference between moments and hours, or days, is impossible to exaggerate. Even without knowing how to meditate, most people have experienced having their negative states of mind suddenly interrupted. Imagine, for instance, that someone has made you very angry, and just as this mental state seems to have fully taken possession of your mind, you receive an important phone call that requires you to put on your best social face. Most people know what it's like to suddenly drop their negative state of mind and begin functioning in another mode. Of course, most then helplessly grow entangled with their negative emotions again at the next opportunity. Become sensitive to these interruptions in the continuity of your mental states. You are depressed, say, but you are suddenly moved to laughter by something you read. You are bored and impatient while sitting in traffic, but then are cheered by a phone call from a close friend. These are natural experiments in shifting mood. Notice that suddenly paying attention to something else, something that no longer supports your current emotion, allows for a new state of mind. Observe how quickly the clouds can part. These are genuine glimpses of freedom. The truth, however, is that you need not wait for some pleasant distraction to shift your mood. You can simply pay close attention to negative feelings themselves, without judgment or resistance. What is anger? Where do you feel it in your body? How is it arising in each moment? And what is it that is aware of the feeling itself? Investigating in this way, with mindfulness, you can discover that negative states of mind vanish all by themselves. Thinking is indispensable to us. It is essential for belief formation, planning, explicit learning, moral reasoning, and many other capacities that make us human. Thinking is the basis of every social relationship and cultural institution we have. It is also the foundation of science. But our habitual identification with thought, that is, our failure to recognize thoughts, as appearances in consciousness, is a primary source of human suffering. It also gives rise to the illusion that a separate self is living inside one's head. See if you can stop thinking for the next 60 seconds. You can notice your breath or listen to sounds, but do not let your attention be carried away by thought, any thought, even for an instant. Pause this book and give it a try. Some of you will be so distracted by thought as to imagine that you succeeded. In fact, beginning meditators often think that they are able to concentrate on a single object, such as the breath, for minutes at a time, only to report after days or weeks of intensive practice that their attention is now carried away by thought every few seconds. This is actually progress. It takes a certain degree of concentration to even notice how distracted you are. Even if your life depended on it, you could not spend a full minute free of thought. This is a remarkable fact about the human mind. We are capable of astonishing feats of understanding and creativity. We can endure almost any torment, but it is not within our power to simply stop talking to ourselves, whatever the stakes. It's not even in our power to recognize each thought as it arises in consciousness, without getting distracted every few seconds by one of them. Without significant training in meditation, remaining aware of anything for a full minute is just not in the cards. We spend our lives lost in thought. The question is, what should we make of this fact? In the West, the answer has been, not much. In the East, especially in contemplative traditions like those of Buddhism, being distracted by thought is understood to be the very wellspring of human suffering. From the contemplative point of view, being lost in thoughts of any kind, pleasant or unpleasant, is analogous to being asleep and dreaming. It's a mode of not knowing what is actually happening in the present moment. It's essentially a form of psychosis. Thoughts themselves are not a problem, but being identified with thought is. Taking oneself to be the thinker of one's thoughts, that is, not recognizing the present thought to be a transitory appearance in consciousness, is a delusion that produces nearly every species of human conflict and unhappiness. It doesn't matter if your mind is wandering over current problems in set theory or cancer research. If you are thinking without knowing you are thinking, you are confused about who and what you are. The practice of meditation is a method of breaking the spell of thought. However, in the beginning, you are unlikely to understand just how transformative this shift in attention can be. You will spend most of your time trying to meditate, or imagining that you are meditating, whether by focusing on your breathing or anything else, and failing for minutes or hours at a stretch. The first sign of progress will be noticing how distracted you are. But if you persist in your practice, you will eventually get a taste of real concentration and begin to see thoughts themselves as mere appearances arising in a wider field of consciousness. The 8th century Buddhist adept Vimalamitra described 3 stages of mastery in meditation and how thinking appears in each. The first is like meeting a person you already know. You simply recognize each thought as it arises in consciousness, without confusion. The second is like a snake tied in a knot. Each thought, whatever its content, simply unravels on its own. In the third, thoughts become like thieves entering an empty house. Even the possibility of being distracted has disappeared. Long before reaching this kind of stability in meditation, however, one can discover that the sense of self, the sense that there is a thinker behind one's thoughts, an experiencer amid the flow of experience, is an illusion. The feeling that we call I is itself the product of thought. Having an ego is what it feels like to be thinking without knowing that you are thinking. Consider the following train of thought, a version of which may have already passed through your mind. What is Harris going on about? I know I'm thinking. I'm thinking right now. What's the big deal? I'm thinking, and I know it. How is this a problem? How am I confused? I can think about anything I want. Watch, I'll picture the Eiffel Tower in my mind's eye right now. There it is. I did it. In what sense am I not the thinker of these thoughts? Thus is the knot of self tied. It isn't enough to know in the abstract that thoughts continually arise or that one is thinking at this moment, for such knowledge is itself mediated by thoughts that are arising unrecognized. It is the identification with these thoughts, that is, the failure to recognize them as they spontaneously appear in consciousness, that produces the feeling of I. One must be able to pay attention closely enough to glimpse what consciousness is like between thoughts, that is, prior to the arising of the next one. Consciousness does not feel like a self. Once one realizes this, the status of thoughts themselves, as transient expressions of consciousness, can be understood. What are we conscious of? We are conscious of the world. We are conscious of our bodies in the world. And we also imagine that we are conscious of ourselves within our bodies. After all, most of us don't feel merely identical to our bodies. We seem to be riding around inside our bodies. We feel like inner subjects that can use the body as a kind of object. This last impression is an illusion that can be dispelled. The selflessness of consciousness is in plain view in every present moment, and yet it remains difficult to see. This is not a paradox. Many things in our experience are right on the surface, but they require some training or technique to observe. Consider the optic blind spot. The optic nerve passes through the retina of each eye, creating a small region in each visual field where we are effectively blind. Many of us learned as children to perceive the subjective consequences of this less-than-ideal anatomy by drawing a small circle on a piece of paper, closing one eye, and then moving the paper into a position where the circle became invisible. No doubt most people in human history have been totally unaware of the optic blind spot. Even those of us who know about it go for decades without noticing it, and yet it is always there, right on the surface of experience. The absence of the self is also there to be noticed. As with the optic blind spot, the evidence is not far away or deep within. Rather, it is almost too close to be observed. For most people, experiencing the intrinsic selflessness of consciousness requires considerable training. It is, however, possible to notice that consciousness, that in you which is aware of your experience in this moment, does not feel like a self. It does not feel like I. What you are calling I is itself a feeling that arises among the contents of consciousness. Consciousness is prior to it, a mere witness of it, and therefore free of it in principle.